This is Brian Robertson, and today's date is August the 14th, 2008, and we are in Paris, Arkansas right now doing an interview for the Arkansas Korean War Project for the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies.
My name is Jimmy R. Mullings, age 75, live in Claremore, Oklahoma.
All right, Jimmy, so where were you born? And can you tell me a little bit about your family and where you were raised and that sort of thing?
I was born here in Paris, Arkansas. My dad was a coal miner. I graduated high school in Paris, Arkansas. And just as I graduated, the Korean War started. And I belonged to the National Guard, so we were mobilized.
So you grew up here in Paris. Do you have any early memories or fond memories of growing up in Paris?
Oh yeah, Paris was the greatest place in the world for a boy to grow up. The creeks and the lakes and the mountains. It couldn't be better. I had a great childhood. We were poor, everybody was in the Depression, so you didn't notice it, but it was a great place.
Do you, speaking of the Depression, are there any memories that stand out in particular about growing up during the Depression?
Well, a lot of good memories, really. I really didn't know that we were that poor. Even though my mother used to say a nickel was as big as a wagon wheel then.
Well, after what kind of got the country out of the Depression was the start of World War II. Do you have any memories as a young man of World War II and what was going on during that time?
Oh yes, I remember very well. My mother was cooking Sunday dinner for several of the family. On December the 7th, after dinner, after we call it dinner or lunch, we were all in the living room and President Roosevelt came on the radio. It was about Pearl Harbor. I remember that like it was yesterday. And I followed the war news, the maps that were in the paper. I kept up with it. I guess I always hoped it wouldn't end until I got old enough to get in the Army. I always wanted to be in the military. But it did. But another war came along, so I got a chance to go to it.
Well, speaking of that war, the Korean War, did you know anything about Korea? Where it was? Ever hear of it before the Korean War started?
I heard of it one time. There was a guy that came back to high school after being in the Army when I was in junior, I think, in high school, and he had been stationed in Korea. First time I ever heard of it. He said it was the worst place in the world. And yeah, it was kind of bad.
So do you remember either hearing on the radio or reading in the newspaper about when North Korea invaded South Korea?
Oh yes, I was in the Guards then, and just barely out of high school. Graduated the 1st of June, and I think June 20th or so when we started. And I followed the news very closely because I thought maybe we might be mobilized. I had wanted to join the Marines, but my parents wouldn't sign the papers. I was still 17. They would not sign the papers, so I had joined the Guard earlier when I was 16. And I really hoped that they would mobilize. I wanted to go, and they did. So I got to go at 17 because my parents didn't have to sign the paper.
So do you think that the United States should have gotten involved in Korea? Was it the right thing for us to go over there and help them out, or do you think we would have been better off staying out of their business?
I really had no opinion on it at that time. I think I was more interested in getting into the Army than anything else. But since then, I do have an opinion. I think Harry Truman was a great man. And I have read that actually the fall of the Berlin War started with Korea. And I really don't know how that connects, but somebody says because we showed Russia we were not going to let communism spread. That actually helped bring down the Berlin Wall. Not Reagan saying tear the wall down.
Well, speaking of communism and things that were going on around the world and even in our own country, do you remember much about Joe McCarthy and
Oh, yes.
kind of the things that he was doing or trying to do in the country?
Oh, yes. Joe McCarthy was an incompetent man that should have never been, in my opinion, never been in government in any way. His sole interest, definitely there were communists in the government. I mean, everybody knows there were some. But that wasn't his interest in getting rid of the communists. His interest was staying on the front page of the paper. And he was very incompetent, in my opinion. That's about all I have to say about that, I guess.
So when North Korea invaded South Korea, was there much of a reaction here in Paris that you recall? Or did people get excited about it? Did they not think much about it? Or
I think it was too close after World War II that a small little country on the other side of the world, and nobody really thought that much about it, one way or another, except the families of the people who were involved, of course. But I don't think there was much said about it.
so you said that you joined the National Guard at 16. Is that seems a little young? I guess men were allowed to join up.
No, you had to be 17 legally, but I've learned down through the years a recruiting officer will believe anything you tell him as long as it don't deny you going in. So I got by with it.
So you're saying you told a little fib.
I told a big one.
And you were in the local guard unit here in Paris. Was that pretty common for a lot of the local boys to be in that unit? I mean, I assume you had a lot of friends who were probably in the unit.
Yes, I did have, and it was pretty common. I won't say most joined, but a number of people joined in high school, and most of them, like I did, at 16. In fact, when we were mobilized, Captain Zeeler called Little Rock and got the ages of everybody. By then I was 17, so it didn't affect me, but I think there was 15 in there that were 16 years old, and they discharged them that day. So they never were activated. But like I said, I was 17 then, so I was in effect.
So how did your parents feel about you joining the Guard?
Well, I don't think they liked it very much, but they didn't really say anything. They let it go. Of course, they weren't expecting a war either.
Right. Well, so when the war finally started and you found out that the unit was going to be activated and possibly sent overseas, what was their reaction then?
Well, my dad didn't show much reaction, but my mother took it pretty hard, I guess, because I could tell 10 years difference in her age when I got back from Korea than when I left. You know, she took it pretty hard.
I'm sure she was worried about you.
Very worried, yes.
And so once the Guard unit was mobilized, where did you go? Were you sent somewhere else for some stateside training before you went overseas?
Yes, we were mobilized, and we spent a few days at the Armory packing up everything. Then took a bus to Fort Smith, got on a troop train, and went to Fort Hood, Texas, where we trained for two and a half months. I don't remember exactly. Then we were alerted for overseas shipment, maybe about mid-December, and then shipped out on a troop train to Camp Stoneman, California. Went on an old paddle wheel river boat down, I don't know if it's a river or part of the bay anyway, for a couple hours to the ship, and then to Korea.
So you went straight to Korea. You didn't stop over in Japan like a lot of the troops did.
Didn't stop anywhere. I never saw one speck of land from San Francisco until we docked in Busan. Well, there's a couple of islands off the tip of Busan, but Korea was the first land we saw.
Do you remember about how long it took you to get over there?
It took 21 days on the ship.
That would seem like a long time to me.
Yeah.
So when you finally arrived in Korea, you said you arrived in Busan. What were, if you can remember, once you're walking off the ship down the gangplank, do you have any thoughts or feelings, or you remember what was going through your head once you finally landed in Korea?
Yeah, it was very, very primitive city, and we loaded on trucks and we're going out to Tent City where everybody went, and first thing I saw was an old lady squatted down on the railroad track using the bathroom. I thought, man, this is right in town. I said, this is a different world here.
So I guess you probably, since you hadn't heard much about Korea, you probably didn't know what to expect. I'm sure once you got over there.
That's right. It was every day was a learning experience.
What do you? So you got, when did you arrive in Korea again? Did you say?
I believe it was February the 10th, and we were there. We arrived before our equipment did. It came on an LST, our guns and trucks and whatever. I don't know how many days we were in Busan, maybe 7 or to 10. Then the LST came. We loaded on it with our equipment and went up through the LSC and landed in Incheon and unloaded all the equipment. And then at that point, someone back home had protested to the government that we hadn't had enough training to be going into combat. So we pulled off for a couple, I don't know, maybe a week or so, and went through some more exercises and were graded by an inspector, and then we went on into combat. And I don't remember what date that was, but that's when it started.
Do you remember? A lot of times when you hear things about Korea and the Korean War, one of the first memories or thoughts that comes up for a lot of people is the weather. It could be hot or it could be really, really cold.
Yes, it went to both extremes, and then there was a rainy season, which was rained every day, night and day. Mosquitoes was terrible in the summertime. Could get awfully cold, especially up in the mountains in North Korea in the winter. But,
do you have any idea or remember any particularly cold days, or do you remember anything about what the temperature might have been?
Oh, it got well below zero. I wouldn't know the exact temperature, but I know it went well below zero in North Korea, up in the mountains, And it got awfully hot in the summertime.
So how did you all cope with the cold?
Well, not easy sometimes. It just, you wore about everything you had, and if you was in a foxhole, like on the perimeter defense, you wore a poncho tied around your neck. We had little cans of alcohol that you could set on fire, and you couldn't see the flame hardly. You set that in the bottom of the hole, spread the poncho over the hole, and you could stay pretty warm.
Huh. That sounds like I guess you did what you had to do.
Oh, yes.
So do you remember talking about being in the foxhole? Remember much about the, I almost hate to use this term, accommodations that you had over there, as far as the shelters or the huts, or what did you live in, and do you remember anything about the food? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it ugly?
We had it pretty good in the artillery. We had a kitchen that was with us most of the time. Sometimes they weren't, but most of the time they were with us. They'd set up a tent, and they'd done a good job on the food. Never had no problem with that. And in the wintertime, when we stayed long enough in a position, we'd set up a big tent. Actually had a stove in it that burned diesel. So in the summertime, mostly we used pup tents, but it wasn't, there was ways to handle it, to get around the weather, survive it.
So what was a typical day like for you if there was such a thing as a typical day?
Well, pretty much just firing that gun, and it went pretty busy for up till, I don't remember when, but maybe in the fall. The line pretty well stayed steady after that. The peace talks were going on, and we stayed in the same position. Well, we was in this position when I left in mid-December. I come home on emergency leave, and
That was 1951.
December 1951. Yeah, and I came home on emergency leave and flew home. They was flying emergency leaves home, and it was the government had chartered the airplane from one airline, I don't remember the name, and it was a crew from a different airline was operating it, and they were flying back and forth, flying emergency leave people home. It was a DC-6. Anyway, we boarded that, went up to, got in Japan. Actually, I went to Japan on a military plane. Then you got this, went to Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan, then across to the Aleutians, and we lost an engine before we got to the Aleutians. One engine went out. They landed, they changed that engine. We left there going to Alaska. I don't remember what point in Alaska. And another engine went out. And before we got to Alaska, the second engine went out. And they come on giving ditching instructions, and kind of a scary situation. There was icebergs down below as big as a county, but anyway, we landed in Alaska, okay, and I boarded another airplane down to Seattle, and then in Seattle the next day in the newspaper it's told about a DC-6 flying emergency leaves home and then taking other troops back. That came into Alaska and started back and crashed in the ocean, and no survivors. I never knew for sure it was the same plane, but everything sounded the same.
Wow. Speaking of flying and getting out of Korea, did you ever have leave while you were over there? And if so, where did you go?
Yes, we had R&R to Japan. I think it was 5 days. They flew us over and back, and that was the only time. But everybody got to go one time to Japan for 5 days. And it was a break, it really was. Kind of hated to go back.
So what did you do while you were over there in Japan?
Well, mostly drink beer. Sit around the clubs every night and drink beer. And we've done some sightseeing in the daytime, but and didn't go back to the base every day and eat a big steak. The Korean veterans that were there and lived could have anything they wanted, anything on the menu. So we ate great for that week.
Sounds good. So do you have any memories of, I know that I guess it was during the spring of 1951, maybe April, May, somewhere around there, that the communists launched a big offensive. Do you have any memories of that? And
Oh yes.
What were you all doing during that time?
Well, we were. I don't know how far we were. Pretty far up into North Korea when that happened, and we started falling back, and we'd back up and stop and fire a while, and back up and fire a while. The gun I was on had a problem. They had to take it back to maintenance, so I didn't really have a gun there for a while. My crew didn't, but of course we were still with the battery, and this went on for several days, and then one night they said we're surrounded, we're cut off, and finally, and I don't know how much factor was to all this, but anyway, finally they said the ROK Marines had broke through behind and there was a way out. And then the 25th Division commander wouldn't let us out because they wanted getting those infantrymen out of there in the trucks, and if our guns got on those narrow mountain roads and broke down, there's nothing that could push them over the edge, so they blocked the road, which made sense. So, but anyway, finally, we did get out. Got back. I went on. They kept the 3 guns, you know, moving and firing, and the rest of us went back farther back to the service battery. But it didn't last very long for me because they needed 2 guys to go in a 50 caliber machine gun back with the guns. Me and my friend Bill Tucker got picked. He accused me of volunteering this boat. I didn't. But anyway, we went back and stayed all the time back, and all the way back to Seoul, which was getting near May Day, and the communists were going to try to retake Seoul on May Day. And I read later in the book, they called it the Night of the Artillery. Seoul had a ring, half a ring of artillery around it. And the order was nobody crossed the river. And we helped that night and stopped the communist advance and turned them around. One regiment did cross the river. It was the 24th Regiment of the 25th Division. It was an all-black regiment. They did cross the river. Their officers were court-martialed and broke up the outfit.
So what exactly was your job when you were working on the gun?
I was a cannoneer. I operated opening and closing the breech block, and actually helping ram the projectile in, and screwing in the primer, and pulling the lanyard to fire the gun.
But it was pretty loud.
Very, very loud, very loud. We never had any earplugs. I never
Really?
covered up my ears. It's a wonder I can even hear today.
It is a wonder. I can't even imagine how loud that would be. Or did you ever have any injuries? And I take it that your unit was never captured or anything like that, were they?
No, we were very lucky. We had 1 man killed when the gun blew up, and 1 or maybe 2 wounded at that time. But that was it. Be better if we got out real easy. Later I read that after the guards had all left the rail, that Baker Battery in one night service had a 60% casualty. But nobody from the original guard was there at that time. We were very lucky. C and A batteries lost more men. I don't know how many. Maybe a total of 15 out of the 3 batteries, but I really don't know.
So how were you all rotated in and out? Did the original members of the guard unit all rotate out together, or did you go, everybody kind of go at their own time?
No, it was a matter of points. Of course, your age was, the older you were, the more points you had. If you had prior service, more points you had. And if you had prior combat service, more points. So there were several World War II veterans in there. Of course, they went first. And it was, I don't know, like maybe 6 or 7 a week. And replacements come in, as the replacements came in, they went out. And they started at less than a year, because if they didn't, the younger ones would have to be there more than a year, and your year was supposed to be the maximum. So they done a good job of rotating the replacements. In fact, that's when the integration started. The blacks, the integrating into the outfits, they done that in Korea. Even though Truman had ordered that in the late 40s, the Army never acted on it. I guess it worked well. Nobody objected to their replacement, whatever color they were.
So you don't remember any kind of problems with say, some of the black guys coming into the unit or anything like that?
No, there wasn't any problems because of race. There was a problem with one black that apparently had been on dope and was put into some kind of fits. There was another one that was a professional gambler, I guess, and slick with the cards, and he got put down, but race-wise, no. Nobody objected what color the replacement was.
I'm sure that was true. So I guess it kind of changed the character of the unit a lot. If you started off with all these Paris boys, and then once the rotations started coming in, you've got men coming in from all places all over the country, and it kind of changed things up a little bit, I'm sure.
Yeah, it did, but it changed almost from the beginning because all the batteries were undermanned when we were mobilized, and they brought us up to strength with draftees and some of the reservists that they had recalled. And then just before we went overseas, they took 8 regular armies out of the stockade and sent them with us. So it was a change almost from the beginning. But it was still always an Arkansas outfit. We flew the Arkansas flag.
So, are there any kind of events or actions or anything that kind of stick out in your mind more than others? Whether they were good ones or bad ones or funny times or.
Yeah, there was one incident. When we got out of that, we were cut off up north, and we were back behind the line when we got assigned to the machine gun. We were all in the back of the truck, 6 or 8 of us. Some were shaving with steel helmets and water in the left, some writing letters. Me and a guy named Rockenhouse was all the way up to the cab of the truck. Of course, they had a tarp on it all tied down. There was a stack of duffel bags right by the cab of the truck. We were sitting on that. This guy crawled up in and sat down on the tailgate of the truck, and he had a hand grenade in his hand, and he had his finger in the ring, and he was swinging it around. And I thought, that don't look too smart. All at once, pin come out, the hand grenade hit the truck bed, and it looked like it was as big as a football. And bam, people started flying out the back of the truck, water and paper going everywhere, and me and Rocky was at the cab. We couldn't get out. We started crawling under them duffel bags. I knew it was going to blow my legs off, and it didn't go off. And then found out the hand grenade had been unscrewed, powder dumped out, the fuse shot, and screwed back together. It was all a joke.
Huh.
But I felt so good I wasn't even mad. It was at the time, to me, it was live.
I'm sure it would have been a very scary experience. Why don't we take a little break right now for just a minute,
Okay.
and we'll get back to this. Okay, we're back with our interview with Jim Mullings here in Paris, Arkansas. And Jim, I wanted to ask you, we talked earlier about different things that were going on. Do you remember having much contact with any of the Allied forces while you were over in Korea?
Yeah, somewhat limited. We were by an English infantry regiment at one time, and exchanged stories with them and visited with them, and I like to hear Englishmen talk anyway. And they had a lot of gin and no cigarettes. We had a lot of cigarettes and no gin, so we done a lot of trading. And then there was some Indians from India that wore the turbans on their head, and the Han River once, we were near them. They were throwing hand grenades into the river and killing these little fish and eating them. And that's pretty well most of the contact we had with any other of the UN forces.
So you weren't around any of the rock forces at all either?
No, not much. There was some South Koreans in our outfit that was assigned to our outfit.
Oh, really?
I don't know if they were South Korean soldiers or if they were just working for the government. I don't know. I don't know who paid them. I think the United States paid them, but anyway, they served with it. They even served on the gun crew, and they did all the laundry and different things. But that's pretty well most of the contact we had with the civilians.
Yeah. Can you remember much about your communication with back home As far as did you write letters? Did you receive letters? And how did you feel about mail call whenever that happened?
Well, yeah, we wrote letters and received letters. It took 30 days for a letter to get home and 30 days for an answer to come back, so it was a 60-day waiting period if you ask a question. And you couldn't call from Korea at all. When we were in Japan on R&R, you could call from Japan. They had phone banks set up, but it took 2, 4, maybe 5 hours for they had to set up a lot of operators. They had to get everything set up halfway around the world. And then you could talk, I believe it was 6 minutes for $40. And I didn't even think I even had $40. I didn't talk. Some of the guys did, but it was a lot different than it is now in the telephone business.
I bet you.
Man, mail call was a very important thing, very important, and I don't think I ever missed a mail call getting letters from my family. And I tried to write as often as I could, up maybe 3 times a week, because I knew they'd word it, so it worked pretty good.
Do you remember much about the peace talks and when they started talking about having a ceasefire? You remember much of, or was anything said among the soldiers themselves about what was going on in regard to the peace talks?
Well, yeah, I remember when they started. I can't tell you the date, but I remember it, and there was a lot of hope, that it was going to work out, and but we never did really know that much. We'd get news once in a while, but usually that they broke off, and then again when they started meeting again, and after a while it got to be kind of hopeless, where you didn't really pay that much attention to it anymore, because it just seemed like it never was going to work. It finally did, but it was like 2 years later when it did, or took more than 2 years maybe. But really didn't pay that much attention to them. Was usually pretty busy, so.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, kind of somewhat related to that question about the peace talks, do you remember much or have anything in the way of feelings either then nor now about what should be done about China during the war? I know that there was a lot of debate within the military and then even within the U.S. government back home about whether we needed to bomb Manchuria, or there was even some talk about using the atomic bomb on them. Did you have any thoughts or feelings then, or do you have any opinion about that now, in hindsight?
I don't know that I had any thought about it then much at all. I certainly do now, and later on after reading and formed an opinion that fighting China in a conventional war is a hopeless situation. They have a never-ending resource of manpower, and if you're going to fight them at all, I guess it would almost have to be nuclear weapons, and that'd be a mass slaughter. But I really never felt that was necessary. MacArthur caused China to come into the war, I feel, because he was supposed to stop 15 miles from the Yalu River, and he didn't. And as the North Korean army, what was left of it, which wasn't much, was crossing the river into China to escape, he not only called airstrikes, but also artillery strikes into China. Well, he gave them every reason in the world to come into the war. You could almost hardly blame them for what they did. And I think MacArthur was senile at this point. I think he was a great general in World War II, but he had passed his prime, and without MacArthur, China probably would have never come into war, or if he had followed orders, China probably would not have come into the war. So I think he's to blame for a lot of problems. He split the army there at one point, and the Chinese come down between it, killed a lot of men that I don't believe was necessary, but I don't know. That's just the way I see it.
So you got into, remind me, when did you get into Korea again?
I believe we landed February 10th, 1951.
Okay.
And
So do you remember, you may or may not remember this, but you had given me some newspaper clippings about how some, I guess they were Chinese, or maybe North Koreans, or maybe both, had kind of moved into this one village, and your unit ended up, well, for lack of a better term, letting them have it. Do you remember anything about that particular encounter?
I remember one particular incident. I really didn't realize there was a newspaper article on this one. Maybe this is not the one, but the one I remember, the air spotters had radioed that Chinese were moving into this village. They estimated about 1,200 Chinese soldiers moving into this village. And we shelled that village all night, 4 guns. And then in the morning at daylight, the infantry was going to attack. Well, when they attacked, there was no resistance. And the final estimate was about 1,000 Chinese soldiers dead, and the remaining up to 200 or so didn't resist at all. Most were just more or less out of their heads. And I remember that very well. Of course, there was a lot of incidents where we shelled villages and towns and whatever, but that one kind of stood out for some reason.
Do you remember anything about your rate of fire? I mean, how long would it take you to go from firing one shell to the next? Do you have any idea?
Well, I think you could possibly do it a shell a minute, but we seldom did that because our shells were pretty big and done a lot of damage, and generally there was a slight change in the sight setting to vary where the shells landed. But I think possibly you could do one a minute, but seldom did we do it that way for more than maybe 2 or 3 shells, and then we'd change the sights.
So was your firing pretty regular? I mean, did you fire every day, or were there some days where you didn't fire at all, or was it just kind of a mixture of things, or what?
Well, the first 5-6 months that we were there, we probably didn't miss a day having some targets, some more than others. Some days a lot of shells, some days quite not so many. But then later on in the fall of '51, the line pretty well stabilized, the peace talks were going on. We didn't move for 3 months or so. It was in one spot. And some days we didn't fire at all then. But with the range we had, we fired 21 miles with a supercharged, so, and the span we had from left to right covered a lot of territory when you can go 21 miles. And we fired still pretty regular, but not every day, and not near as much on the days. So it had kind of quieted down some, even though it fired back up later, like early '52, late '51, early '52, Old Baldy and Heartbreaker Edge, and there were some pretty big battles. But for a while there, it was fairly quiet.
Do you remember ever having any trouble with any of your weapons? Any problems?
Well, my gun was in ordnance when we were when we got cut off North Korea and retreated back. It was in ordnance, and then we had the tube had to be changed on those guns. I forgot how many rounds that had to be changed or they'd blow up, which we had one blow up. Each firing battery had one blow up. Our battalion had 3 guns blow up, and so that was a definite problem. And after we'd run out of time on them and we didn't have one to change, then we would load it up, have a 50-foot lanyard, we'd get everything set, everybody get in the foxhole behind the gun, and I'd pull the 50-foot lanyard to fire the gun, and until we could get the tube changed. The ordnance could come up and change the tube in a half day, but if they had them, but that seemed to be a problem sometimes. So. And this machine gun was a problem one time. A story. Me and my friend Bill Tucker went on the hill on perimeter defense. We had 50 caliber and 30 caliber machine guns set up around the outfit, and we got up there. This guy had decided to take the machine gun apart, and it seems he got bored. And in the Army, they stress you should be able to take your weapon apart and assemble it either blindfolded or in the dark, and so that's what he had proceeded to do, and he did get it took apart, but he couldn't get it put together. So that was a little problem. I chewed him out and sent him on, and I was putting the machine gun together, and my friend Bill was laying across the sandbags with a carbine, and he looked around and he said, "You know, if he causes me to get killed and you make it, will you please shoot that son of a bitch?" So that was, it came out okay. There was no problem, but it was a little aggravating to go on a hill and find a machine gun disassembled.
I'm sure. I was wondering, do you have any lasting impressions of Korea? Anything that sticks in your mind about your time over there? Could be something that you saw, or something that you did, or something you heard. Anything that just kind of, well, just maybe when you first think of being over there, this is maybe one of the first things that pops into your mind.
Well, that would be the refugees. There was always a lot of refugees coming and going, and a lot of kids. And I don't know how they made it without starving, and maybe some of them did starve to death. You know, we had it pretty good. We had good food and whatever. It seemed like they had nothing. I saw 2 dogs over at all times in Korea, the only 2 domestic animals I saw, and they were butchering them. And I thought it was through desperation that they were eating the dogs, but actually I found out later that the Koreans, that some did eat dogs. But anyway, these people didn't have much. About everything they had was on their back, and they seemed to always be moving. I really don't know how they hardly survived it. But that did make an impression on me, especially the kids.
Are there any funny stories that you can remember that kind of make you laugh? You had talked before about the story about the guy with the grenade, swinging it around on his finger. Is there any others that were maybe not necessarily funny, but kind of just, I don't know, stories that kind of make you think? I think we had talked at one point a little bit off camera about one day you were driving a Jeep through the mountains.
Yeah, that was, I had, the captain let me use his Jeep. There wasn't much going on, it was quiet. I had a cousin in the infantry outfit, and I knew what outfit he was in, and some guy went with me. We drove over to visit him. On the way back, I passed 2 what I thought was South Koreans. They were always thumbing a ride. They wore the American steel helmets, fatigues, and carried the carbines, and I stopped and they got in behind the back of the Jeep. And we was driving through the mountains, and they started pecking me on the shoulder and trying to say something, and I was just aggravating them, acting like I couldn't understand them. I just kept driving, and they got real excited, and finally I knew they was wanting out. Finally I stopped, and they jumped out and ran down the hill, and I came on back to the outfit. And then the captain found this canvas bag in the Jeep, and it had all of our artillery positions mapped out. So the intelligence people came up and talked to me about where I picked them up, where they got out and everything. And apparently they were North Koreans, spies, and like I've said a lot of times, they were behind me with a carbine and I was aggravating them, which wasn't very smart, but I got by with it.
Well, during your time over in Korea, I was wondering, were you ever promoted, or did you stay the same rank, or?
I was private first class when I went to Korea. I made corporal in Korea, and then in the fall, a while before we come home, and the supply sergeant, our battery supply sergeant, all the supply sergeants were stationed back at service battery, and then they just come up when they need to bring supplies. But anyway, his clerk was a regular Army guy, and his year extension was up, and he was going home, and he asked me to come back to service battery with him and be the supply clerk, which was called for a corporal rating. And he was going to be the first to rotate, and then I could make staff sergeant and then sergeant first class, and which was a good opportunity if was that interested in making the rank. But I didn't want to leave the gun crew, so I turned it down and stayed with the gun crew, and I never regretted that. But that's about it on the rank, I guess.
You had said earlier that you were granted an emergency leave to come home. Do you mind sharing what that was about?
That was about 3 weeks before I would have rotated home. My grandmother was very bad, and my folks had talked to the Red Cross people about getting me an emergency leave to come home, and since I was so close to rotation, I guess it wasn't that big a problem to do. Anyway, I did come home about 3 weeks early, and she was in church, and the rumor had got out some way that I had been killed in Korea, and some lady came up to her and told her she was sorry to hear that I got killed, and she completely went out of her mind. And that was part of the reason of coming home, to let her see me, since we grew up next door. She half raised me, and so I did get to come home, and but it didn't do any good. But about a year later, she did come back to normal. But that was the whole reason for the emergency leave, and they just came up and told me, you can go home, and so I had to make my own way home. I rode the ammo truck back to service battery, and then caught a ride back to Kempo Airport, and a military plane to Tokyo, and then there was a commercial plane that the Army had chartered the airplane from one airline, I don't remember the name, and the crew was from a different airline, but they were working for the government, flying emergency leaves home. And we went up, flew to Hokkaido, and then across to the Aleutians, and we lost an engine going across to the Aleutians, and stopped and changed engines, then started on to some point in Alaska. I don't remember where. Anyway, the engine went out again, past the no turnaround point, and before we got to Alaska, the second engine went out, and they come on the intercom giving ditching instructions, and it was a touch and go situation, but we did get on the ground in Alaska. And then the next day, I got a plane down to Seattle and read in the paper that this DC-6, which is what this was, flying emergency people home, had left Alaska going back to Korea, taking troops, and crashed in the ocean. And I never knew for sure it was the same airplane, but everything sounded the same. That was a little scary situation.
I'm sure it was. So did you have any feelings about leaving? I mean, was it hard to leave your buddies, or I guess a big part of you are probably ready to go, but...
Well, no, really I was more toward the bottom end of the rotation, and the biggest part of them had already rotated when I left, and the others was going to be, pretty quick. So it wasn't that much, but like I just said, the point that I had to make my own way back was kind of surprising. they provided every step for me on the way over there, but it was up to me to come back. So thought that was a little unusual.
Yeah. So what was it like to get back to Paris?
Oh, it's great. It's always good to come home. I still feel that way today. It's good to come home, but you know, all my family and friends were glad to see me, and I'm glad to see them and be back. And it just really is an exceptional feeling to come home, especially after you know, a year in that kind of conditions. Paris is a good place to grow up.
So what did you end up doing once you got back to Paris? Did you hang around here and get a job, or what?
I came back to Camp Chaffee and drive back and forth to Paris each night, waiting on discharge. And when I finally got the discharge, I went all over northeastern Arkansas trying to find a job, and it was really lean back then. So I finally had to end up leaving and going to Wichita, Kansas. And I worked for Beech and Boeing Aircraft. They were hiring everybody. You didn't even have to have experience. And so I got almost 4 years experience there as a aircraft mechanics, and then went to Tulsa and got my A&P license, hired in at American Airlines as a mechanic, and then eventually did an inspection job. I was inspector the last 10 years or so. I was there in a total of 38 and a half years in Tulsa at American Airlines, and retired at 61, and been busy ever since.
Now you've been busy getting interviewed.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to come out and meet with us today, and to take part in the Butler Center's Arkansas Korean War project. And we're certainly very appreciative of your willingness to share your memories with us.
Well, I'm glad to do it, and I appreciate your time.